Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. This week's guest is Ron Collins, a very enthusiastic writer winner back in 1998. He is one of our iconic photos for Writers of the Future, with him kissing his framed certificate after having been announced. He was initially published in WOTF 14 as a finalist with the story The Disappearance of Josie Andrew, and then the following year as a winner in volume 15 with the story Out of the Blue. He has since gone on to write at least 24 novels in multiple genres: sci-fi, fantasy, and political thriller. His name recently came up when I was having dinner with Dean Wesley Smith and Chris Rush, which sparked my asking him to join me today. I had the distinct pleasure of reading a few novels in the Stealing the Sun series to prepare for this interview. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And yes, that picture is always one of my favorite memories of my experience. And I like to think that I know that there have been several people who have come back twice, right? In fact, my class had three of us published finalists one year and then back the next. But I'm still relatively certain that I am the only person walking the planet Earth who has stood on a Writers of the Future stage and kissed two plaques. So,
absolutely, you have that distinct honor. All right, so how'd your story as an author start?
Oh boy, I think, like most, people who end up writing for a long time, I've always kind of dilly-dallied around with it. But for me, it really started when I was working, when I had gotten out of college and I was working. I'm an engineer by degree, and I'd been sent to a 6-week liaison in Washington, D.C. And I spent that first week doing all the touristy things and so forth. And then I remember like a Friday night sitting there going, well, I'm all by myself here in Washington, D.C. I got 5 weeks. What am I going to do? And I finally thought, I could just write. Nobody has to see me here. I get 5 total weeks cloistered around and doing my thing. And so I'd always kind of told myself I was going to write, but I was too busy working, and I had a kind of high-powered job. And so I started at that stage, going home every night and starting to pound the keyboards, and I had such great fun. I wrote like 35,000 words of horrible fiction. But even then, I knew that once I started going, I said, I'm going to do this forever now. I had written some in high school and some in college, and I kind of quit to do the professional stuff. But once I started going, it was like, okay, I'm never going to stop this. I need to figure out what this is. So I immediately went down into the basement of my furnished apartment there in DC and looked at what used to be called a bookstore and go and get books. Right? That used to be where I'd spend all my time. And so I got a copy of the Novel Writers Market, the big thick thing that talked about where writers could sell their stuff, right? Because I thought, well, if I'm going to do this forever, I want to make it a career. Here I am with my first 30,000 words of horrible fiction, and I'm thinking, make it a career. And so cutting a long story short, yes, I deemed by looking at all these markets that were all the thousands of markets that were out there for writers that obviously you could make a living doing this. And so my naivete of not knowing how hard that was helped me because at that stage I was kind of off and running. And so when I came back home, I talked to my wife and said, okay, honey, you're married to a writer. I don't know what that means, but you're going to figure it out. So that was my kickstart. And that was back in the, late 80s, right? So I've been doing this for quite a while. And I think the bottom line for that to me is that whole thing. When I started off, I knew I was going to do this forever. It just wasn't going to be let's see how this plays. It meant something big to me. And that's important. It's been important to me because it's been a very long cycle with ups and downs. and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. We're gonna address those ups and downs in this interview here. But so now you're a full-time writer. So at what point did you switch from being an engineer doing engineering stuff to being able to stop doing that and rely upon your income from writing?
I've been a full-time writer since 2013. So, but it was a kind of a long haul to get to that point. Like I said, I'm an engineer by degree, and I had a series of jobs that I really liked. I consider myself to be good at it. A lot of people said I was good at it, and they paid me, good money for that. But yes, once I kind of determined that you could make your living doing this, the next step was figuring out, did I actually really have the talent to do it? Because while I was naive and so forth, I'm also a realist, right? You have to figure out whether you can actually do the work, which the contest was great at helping me figure that out, or at least give me an open window to that. So my wife and I have worked on this for quite a long time. So we understood in the early days. In fact, Chris Rush and Dean Leslie Smith helped us out quite a bit in the early stages. They didn't really know us, but we went to a couple of other things, and a couple of other writers. Mike Resnick is another great mentor of mine in the early days, helped him figure out what it meant to be a writer professionally, meaning the dollars and cents, and can we actually make this work? So my wife and I really worked on our finances a lot, right? We became not cheap, but frugal, right? When we wanted something, we went out, we got the best we could get, so we didn't have to replace it and so forth. And we worked very hard to pay off our house early, and we created a foundation of our finances to where we didn't have to worry about things. And so it wasn't until about 2013, actually more like about 2012 or so, when my wife finally came to me and said, okay, Ron, when you're writing, you're always super happy. When you're working, you're either really happy or really not happy. So you should just quit your job, and we can handle this. And it took me about 6 months to come to the point where I believed her. and so that's kind of how that happened. She finally crowbarred me out of the corporate world and into the world of being a full-time writer. And so the bottom line is, we worked very hard to get to the point where we didn't need as much income if we had lean years, because we knew there were going to be lean years. And so we kind of scale our spending up and down depending on how things go.
Right. Kevin Anderson, Rebecca Mesta, they had a formula they used. They had a year's worth of expenses set aside in the bank before they quit their day job. And then at the point that they had a year's worth, that's when they said, okay, we're done with our day jobs, and went full-time professional writers on both of them. Did you have any type of a formula you were using to decide, besides your wife taking the crowbar to you?
That's a fantastic frame of reference. The other point, we had a daughter at the time, and so we wanted more than a year's worth of pad. And then the second piece was, when I first started writing, my wife was copy editing, so she was doing freelance work and didn't have benefits. By the time that we had gotten to the point where I could move out of the corporate world, she had a corporate world, and so she had benefits and she had insurance. So for us, the more secure thing was, can we get insurance? Right, and that was before the Affordable Health Care Act and other things, where now my wife doesn't work anymore, but we can access insurance through the Affordable Health Care Act that was not really available to us in the past. And now our daughter is grown and living her own life, so we don't have to worry so much about whether we're going to make a little girl destitute if we make a bad choice. Right? So I think that's another piece of, there are different new writers coming through in different ways. When I was starting, the security aspect, if I were all by myself, I probably would have quit my job earlier, because the ramifications would have just been to me. Whereas, when you have a wife and a family, you're feeling a little more pressure.
That makes sense. that totally makes sense. All right. So now, Stealing the Sun. That was it was really easy to get into that series. So that evolved from your 24-hour story from Writers of the Future, the workshop there where you're supposed to write a 24-hour story. So how'd that all come about?
Thank you. First off, thanks for the comment, because it's a story that obviously is very dear to me. Yes, it was one of the 24-hour stories that I wrote there in my first year at Writers of the Future. And, the classic kind of Gestalt thing where Dave Wolverton at the time, Dave Farland, I have a hard time calling him Dave Farland because I've known him as Dave Wolverton so much.
Sure, yeah.
Walked around and essentially had everyone contribute something into a pile and then redistributed everything. And so I got Amy Sterling Castle's pen and pencil holder, right? A little leather satchel with round tubes in it. And, they said, you look at it and think about it and try to imagine what it might be if it wasn't a pen and pencil holder and so forth. And so those became the essentially wormhole torpedo tubes, right? I was saying, well, what would go in those things? Well, I mean, it'd be kind of like they look like torpedo tubes. And, okay, I'm a science fiction guy. What would I do there? Well, no, they wouldn't be torpedo tubes. They'd be wormhole tubes. You shoot them off and they do, but then I had a second piece because I was out beginning to work on the draft. And I remember being there in Los Angeles, out on the patio, and the sun is coming down, and there was a bowl of fruit there with these great big beautiful oranges, right? And the oranges became the sun. And so, well, they're shooting the wormhole holes into the sun. What would they do that for, right? And out came the root of the story, that I wrote. Actually, the core of the story was written in a couple of hours, really, which is always a fun fact.
Wow, yeah.
And then the last little kicker of that is, as I'm sitting there, Carla Montgomery, who was one of the attendees of that first year for me, walked in and she says, "What's your story about?" And I gave her like a 1 or 2 line tagline, and she says, "Oh, they're stealing the sun." And I went, "Oh, exactly."
Wow, that's an amazing backstory.
Yeah, and then the super fun thing that I had the great pleasure of attending while Algis Budrys was still alive and involved in the project, and he was such a genius. And I admired him. I read his, I strongly suggest any new writer read his Writing to the Point. If you want to learn how to write stories and story structure, that's fantastic. But he, during the night that we go through and critique, read all the stories and stuff, he was not feeling well at the end. And so he missed critiquing my story. So he made it up to me by having breakfast with me that following morning to give me his critique in person. I'm going, oh my gosh.
Wow.
Oh no. But the best thing was we sat down and he's got my manuscript there and he just pushes it over to me over the table, and he says, "Pretty good. Send it off." And that was it. The rest of the time we talked about careers, which was
wow. Fantastic. 24-hour story, send it off is his only critique.
Pretty good. Send it off. I'll remember that for as long as I can remember. I will remember.
Absolutely. But that's amazing how that came to be too. It's so interesting how sometimes these epic storylines, you're like, wow, how did you think of that? How did that come up? And then just what you just said right there, which is also part of which has come up several times before, part of the brilliance of the Rise of Future workshop, in that whole formula of, there's that one essay by Owen Hubbard on story out of the hat, where his editor, Ed Bodine, tells him, okay, here's, turns over trash cans, here you go. And he says, okay, it becomes a kubanka. And that's that whole story that evolves from that. Are there any parts of the workshops, either time that you attended, that still stick in your head so many years later?
Well, I mean,
in addition to breakfast with AJ?
There are so many. I mean, when you have such an intense, I remember walking out of that first week's experience, right? And it is just such a intense experience between the workshop itself, right, and the writing. And I know the first week that I went there, I told myself I was going to write a story every day, right? And I ended up writing 8 stories while I was there, right? Because I wanted to just immerse, I wanted to be there and be a writer. And then, of course, the big gala that happens afterwards is almost impossible to describe, even if you see it. You know, you have to be it.
Yeah.
But I remember afterwards sitting in the airport in the quiet and everything just settling down and going, well, Ron, that is never going to happen to you again. But lo and behold, a year later. But there's just so many experiences. And, you know, the workshops itself, I think, to get into the raw writing piece, right? Because I can go through 15 snapshot experiences. For me, the two writing things that I carry over even today, and it's been, you know, gosh, what is it, 24, 23 years, however long it's been.
Yeah.
The two things that I really carry today are, number one, there's what is art or something like that. The message that I talk to new writers about when they start, you know, getting into this writing fast thing, right? Can you actually write a story in a day? Well, of course you can, but is it any good? Well, sometimes they're even better than the ones that you chug through, right? Because you're into creative brain and so forth. And, you know, the message that I get is anything that creates an emotional impact at the end is, in quotes, good enough, right? And sometimes people will read that and say, oh, good enough. I don't want to be just good enough. I want to be brilliant. And go, you don't realize how hard it is to create an emotional impact at the end, right? That's L. Ron Hubbard was greatly underplaying that aspect. And then the other thing that I carry over that I actually think of differently today than I did when I first ran into it is the whole, the manuscript factory, where he goes through and analyzes at the end of every year or some period different things that are working for him and what he's able to sell and what he's not able to sell, and he's trying to do something. When I first experienced that, it was kind of mind altering, because I was thinking I need to be thinking about these from all my markets and so forth, right? But in reality, what I think about it today is not so much markets and so forth. It's more about, if you're going to be a long-term writer, you need to be constantly self-assessing yourself, right? You need to understand where you're at, where you want to go, and it's not good enough just to sit down and write your brilliant writings, right? You have to be a full artist. You have to be a full-blown participant in what you're creating over the long haul. And so I actually go back and think of those two things often.
Great, thank you. All right, so anything else from the workshop that you got, those two things? Do you still maintain relationships with either year?
Number one, I about every 6 months or a year, maybe I kind of duck in and look at what everyone else has been doing, you know, from the group. Scott and Amy, obviously, I have a strong personal connection to Scott and Amy from the viewpoint that we were both, all three, you know, in both sessions.
Sure.
Scott I've occasionally touched base with more from a professional standpoint, because he was so much ahead of me on the independent curve, right? So he was a partial mentor at certain points, and mostly I admire the heck out of him. And Amy I still contact quite a bit. I don't think she's writing fiction so much anymore. She's doing a lot of social commentary and so forth. But she's we actually have another fun memory of that. Is our second time together. We actually wrote a weird collaboration in the middle of writing our 24-hour stories. We wrote our 24-hour stories by giving each other prompts, and then in between we sat at the same table face to face, and we wrote a collaboration we took the two prompts that we had and we wrote a collaboration, and we swapped it back and forth. So like, I think I started writing my own story and she wrote the collaboration, and then 30 minutes later she sent me back the file and she started writing her own story and I wrote on the collaboration. So we got 3 stories.
Wow, in 24 hours.
Yeah, and we're still actually trying to find a market for that third one, because it's kind of weird, but we both really love it.
Okay, good.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah, I try to keep in touch with them. But Steve Mohan was in my second session, and I run into him on several workshops. He's a fantastic writer, still doing stuff. Jim Hines, I occasionally drop notes to. I just saw that Scott Huggins is back writing again after, I think, some life issues. So I need to reach out and touch base with him. It's a neat little camaraderie of spirit to be a part of the contest and all of the people that are associated with it.
Yeah, that's way cool. Now, your story, Stealing the Sun, what's interesting, the first thing that got me was that you got 3 protagonists. So you've got 3 separate storylines that are moving forward. And it's a 7-book series, 9-book series?
Yeah, it's a 9-book series.
9-book series. And they all, even despite how life-threatening and keep things going, those 3 darlings stay going, take a licking and keep on ticking. But it's amazing how they interweave, and they're very close, and then they separate out, and then they're very close. It's just, so how's that going now, creating a series? Did you always envision it as 9 books, or that it was going to have a long curve, or how'd that go? Because it's very rare that you see something with 3 protagonists, major storylines going all throughout the entire series with a single author.
Did I always envision it as a 9-book series as a hidden dig? No. In the early days, I envisioned it as the classic, trilogy kind of a thing. But then I realized, and this is, we could go a whole bunch of different directions on this. I realized it was not a trilogy. It had to be 5 books. It definitely had to be 5 books. And then I got to 5 books. I said, no, it's got to be 6. There's no question it has to be 6. And then I got to 6, and I went, oh no, it's 9. Son of a gun. First off, thank you. I live vicariously through all of my characters, which I think is probably not unusual for most writers, or a lot anyway. I think of myself as a character writer rather than an idea writer. And whether that's true or not, please nobody tell me otherwise. I love all of those characters. At the end of the day, I think if I spread out over the 9 books, I consider myself to have really an ensemble of about 9 different characters as they roll through time. And all of them, in my mind, are having something to say about leadership. When it really comes right down to it, they all come from different positions, and they fit. I tend to spend a lot of time, my, in quotes, free time, my research time, doing things on history of like World War I and World War II, and I'm not really interested in the battles and so forth, but I get interested in the idea that a battle changes, or that the situation changes because of what 3 tiny people, those little people did. It's not the Eisenhowers and the so forth. It's the people on the ground doing something, right? And those are the people who intrigue me and get me excited. And so most of the characters that I have in here, even those that are actually in more leadership positions, are oftentimes not those with a whole lot of power, but you get things done through the way you influence others, or by getting things done, you influence others, or so forth. And so in that sense, that's one of the things that I would get myself caught up into the storyline and go, oh, I don't know where to go with this one. Well, what does this mean to everyone else? Or what does this character's behavior mean to everyone else around them? And, that helped me. That generally helps me also understand what the character's behavior ought to be.
So you say we can go lots of different directions. I wanted to be able to address this because obviously this is the Writers of the Future podcast, and we're interested in, tips and inspiration and whatnot for writers, but how you do that and how you keep the interest level up for yourself, but also how you can keep, like, sometimes it's really easy to keep a central protagonist, and he's the guy, okay, you're rooting for him, and you're like, oh no, please don't happen. Oh, it just happened to him. You don't want that. But now you got, for me, it was the three. You said there's way more than that, but the ones that I got to know were those three. And just how you go about doing that as a writer, and the research to be able to keep all three of those lines really strong, and each one is I read them as protagonists.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I definitely always like the idea that every character is the protagonist of their own story. So I'm trying to tell more fully fledged stories across a suite of characters, right? So three serious characters in the first book. The second book is going to introduce you to another one that will end up carrying through, and then the third book will end up introducing you to a collection of more. And it actually gets tied up, the how-to for me gets tied up into things like the mechanics of storytelling, right? Which, again, Algis Budry's right to the point. Live it, know it, breathe it, right?
Yeah.
So that's just mechanically what is this character's problem? What is this character's problem? How are they going to logically try to solve it? And I find that it's the thing, to make myself excited is to put myself in that character's shoes and to stop being Ron Collins and start being Torrance Black, right? Who is Torrance Black? Why is he doing it? Oh, that's interesting. Here's his background. I wrote a little scene with him sitting in his backyard as a kid with his dad watching the stars, just because I was thinking, where does this piece, right? And I love that. Obviously, I wrote it years ago, and I still can, my hair can still stand on end when I think about it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things I would tell anyone who's trying to write is really just get into your characters and love them to death and become them. Stop being you and become the characters. Obviously, the characters carry pieces of me in them before it's all said and done. Even the ones that I don't, even the parts of me that I don't like so much, I put into some of the other characters that come along later. Right? We're not all perfect human beings, and we have negative thoughts. So. And then the next piece of that is, within the context of the science, and there's time dilation, and there's faster than light travel, and I'm putting those two things together. And so, how does the technology and the science of the world that I'm working with play with each one of the character sets, right? Without giving away too much, one of the odd things about this series is either book 1, 2, or 3 could be used as an entryway into the series. Once you're through the first 3, then they kind of have to be read
in sequence.
But really, 1, 2, or 3 could act as an entryway because they span across different time periods. Book 1 is all about classic space travel, slower than light. And so you get time travel by time dilation, right?
Right.
It introduces faster than light travel to some degree, but really book 2 is where that begins to come into play. And so I had time diagrams all over the place, right? And that was so much fun for me because it hits all of my techie buttons, my engineering. I was as well as an engineer, I was for a couple of years, I was president of an astronomy club, and I got to talk with a whole bunch of different, really super experts in astronomy, thinking about these things. And so I was playing with star charts and time passes and all sorts of stuff like that. If that kind of thing gets you excited, then you should do it.
Right. You
should write the things that get you excited. If you find yourself in the middle of writing something, and you're not excited by the characters and the situations and so forth, then either you're not writing the right thing, or you're in the middle of the book blahs and you just need to push through and things will be brilliant again. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question totally.
You are. Because I wanted to just go into a little bit, just explore and see where it took us about your story. Because you referenced there, which is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, that bridging between science fact and science fiction. So at least what's currently still science fiction. It's not to say that in 10 years it won't become science fact, but you have time dilation at the beginning, but then you introduce FTL, faster than light travel, where they're going back in their time dilation and below speed of light, and then someone else comes up and catches to them, and they've gone faster than light. So you've got those things merging together. What kind of an engineer are you?
I am a mechanical engineer by degree, and most of my work was in software engineering and electronics engineering.
Okay, yeah. So on that, because I know a lot of that makes sense, because some of the stuff that were problems or that you got into on the schematics and working out when near the end of the first book there, where they have issues in the saboteur and that whole thing that happens. There's a lot of electronic stuff, and so you have a good feel for that. So that was very believable what you were saying.
Thank you.
So I was just curious how much write what you know is a common adage, and if you don't know, then learn, do research so that you can actually tell a plausible story there. Yeah. But how much you work on what you had as an engineer versus what you had to further research, and then how you had to feather it in with science fiction to make it all, the willing suspense of disbelief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a fun question.
Yeah.
When it comes right down to it, the most important thing to me, I write a lot for analog. You'll find I've had, 25 or 30 stories in analog, and I've got a couple more coming out. A couple of them have been about time dilation. In particular, Decadad was one that was about a grandfather who was traveling and coming back to see his great-great-great-grandson, and another. When you write for analog, you need to be able to write science believably before it's all said and done. Yeah, there's always some place where you're kind of jumping off the beaten path, right? But that's the kind of old saw, that get all the science right that you can, so that when you ask the reader to take that one leap, that they're willing to take the one leap.
Right.
And people, writers break that all the time. There's oftentimes great science fiction stories that don't really have any believable science in it whatsoever, and they work just fine, right? As long as you're able to enjoy them. And so for me, the story is first. I don't really, I can remember Rob Sawyer, for example, does a whole bunch of research and then kind of writes his work, right? I write the stories and then figure out along the way what I need. And sometimes if you look at my early drafts, you'll see these places where I have big brackets where go figure out what, and I'll highlight those in yellow so I don't forget them, right? And things like that. But to me, the story is first. But I also have a great deal of joy about learning learning new things, right? And I mentioned Rob Sawyer. One of the things I just like to do for fun is occasionally, find interviews of scientists. And Rob Sawyer is a fantastic speaker. He has 15 or 20 really great, where he addresses Google and he addresses other conferences and so forth, and he's talking about science. But what I get out of that, what I love out of that, is seeing the way his brain works as he goes about figuring out what he needs. Before it all gets said, right? And so then at the end of the day, maybe where the root of your question is, when do you jump off? When you jump off the beaten path, how do you do that? And in Stealing the Sun, the place where I feel like I did that the most was as I'm working, and where I really had actually some of the most fun was when I was beginning to work on trying to add the verisimilitude with the to make it feel right when it came to the math and the physics of wormhole development, right? We don't have wormholes in the real world, as best as I know. Right? We don't have faster than light travel. And in my world, the whole conceit that you determine pretty much right away is that is that humanity is going to go to the stars with faster than light travel by shooting these wormhole pods into the sun and into a star, and using that fusion energy connected up into this new technology and engine drive to create something close to the warp kind of mindset, right? Where you fold time or do whatever. And so what I had great fun with is working on what would the math look like if you had to do multi-dimensional. I thought it had to be multi-dimensional, and so I read a bunch of stuff and learned a bunch of stuff about things like string theory and multi-dimensional math. It helps that my wife is a math major with all theory and no application. I'm an engineer, all application, no theory. She's so we worked that out. And so I think, that's the most important thing for me in that sense, was to know when I was playing with something that was not real. And I actually equate that aspect to, as I was writing my fantasy series, The Saga of the God-Touched Mage, I created a fairly complex magic system, right, that I wanted to be cohesive. I wanted it to be proper, and people would read it and go, okay, well, then it works. Right?
Yeah.
I want that same thing, because effectively creating faster than light travel with wormhole flow of energy out of a sun into an engine is a piece of magic, right? You want that to, but you want it to be proper, and you want people who read it to not just roll their eyes and say, "Oh, you're just hand wavy on there." Now, some people, the super hardcore physicists, might look at it and go, "Oh, yeah, that is hand wavy," but of course, it's science fiction. That's the place where you're jumping off. But I think if you do it right, that's where it's also the most fun.
Yeah, but it's also, and that gets back into the actual, I don't want to say it's purpose, but one of the facets of science fiction is that it does get the engineer, the scientist, whoever went, oh, that's an interesting concept, I wonder, and then start going in that direction. I did a interview with another science fiction writer, Doug Richards, and he had this one most recent book called Portals, which is these portals, and you get these wormhole things. But he does a lot. He's also scientist, and he's got a lot of it's interesting how much stuff actually exists and how close we are to certain things. And he talks about the research going into antimatter and what that would actually be. And, the whole thing is that based upon our current, science technology, the universe should be contracting, but it's actually expanding. So what's making that happen? And so he went possibly along that direction there. And it's amazing how much stuff might be actually going on that we don't know. He's in one of his books, earlier ones I read, there's actual patents that are filed on certain technologies which are still being written as science fiction, but they're actual patents now.
Right.
Based upon however they got it from what they're seeing in these UFOs that they are releasing, they're now giving this technology that they've got patents on.
Yeah, I mean, that fits, one of the things that I loved about being astronomy club president in Arizona, which is Arizona is a hotbed for astronomy, University of Arizona. In the process of a year or so, I probably interviewed maybe 25, had dinner with and discussed things, maybe 25 of the top scientists in the world. And one of them that strikes me the most was this young woman who led the team that did the first imaging of a real planet outside of our system, right? I mean, and I was thinking there as I was eating dinner with her, was going, of all the billions of people who have lived on this earth, this is the first person who actually was able to see another planet that, outside of our system. And I'm going, wow, the kinds of things that can be done today, the things that we're learning about how the universe works today are things that, yes, some science fiction writers were writing about them 70 years ago and 50 years ago and so forth. But even then, the brain can almost not capture the glory of where things really are. right? It's
Mhm.
part of what I love about the research question, right? That you run into things and you go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't even know enough to ask that question.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, our keynote speaker last year at the awards ceremony, Lieutenant General J.T. Thompson, Air Force, was one of the ones that created the Space Force. He was one of the major people that created Space Force.
cool.
And he said, as it was going on, where we are now, we don't know a whole lot more now than we did like 2,000 years ago about space. When you get into it, what there actually is to know, because the more that we see there is, the more we realize, oh my gosh, there's so much we do not know.
Mm-hmm.
So for him, it was science fiction. That was his inspiration to delve in this area. And we've had several astronauts as well as speakers who were inspired by science fiction. It made them want to go off and do this and go into space. It was all science fiction at the time when they were starting, but now it's a lot of stuff is science fact. And you have the Elon Musks of the world that are,
Right.
pushing forward what's been talked about for 100 years, the colonization of another planet.
Yeah.
They're actually taking that, making that real.
Yeah, and I think to bring this back into the science fiction world, I think the world owes a debt to the old time golden age science fiction writers. The Ray Bradburys and the Ed Hamiltons and the L. Ron Hubbards and the even back in the second the second ages, right, with the Jerry Pournells and the Robert Heinleins and so forth. I know there were time periods where governments were bringing science fiction writers into the world, into their world, to talk about, to open their minds up around what are the opportunities. And certainly you can go back and read a friend of mine, we were having some conversation about why would anyone read old science fiction, right? And I'm going, oh my gosh, why do you even ask that question? The stories are so brilliant, and the ideas and the hope and the longing and the future forecasting. Would we have had space programs as early as we had without science fiction doing what science fiction does? We probably would have had them eventually, but I think I think that the idea of adventure out in space is inherent to the human condition.
I think so. Yeah.
So I think we owe old time science fiction writers in particular a silent debt of gratitude that they often don't really get, or that when we start talking about them as science fiction fans, regular people kind of roll their eyes and go, "Oh yeah, no, I don't think you understand. I don't think you get it."
No, the first time I read the Lensman series, if somebody wants to, they can shoot all kinds of holes of it. To me, it was just all of a sudden, boom, I was out there. It was such an inspiration, that whole concept of what that was in the cosmos. And even, from Aresia, you had the mentor, and you find out that it's several of these different regions together as one entity. And it's like, wow, that's all cool. You could say, oh, well, that's just fantasy. Okay, but that was space opera. That was pure,
Yeah. But they know the story, and I think that's one of the things new writers need to think about. Go back and read the canon. First off, it's nice to know the canon, but even beyond that, if you find a story where the science doesn't work anymore, but you still get into the story, you've learned, that writer understood story and understood the human condition, because the human condition almost doesn't really care about the technical details. They care about what they can carry away from the story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a writer, the writers who are still read today, understood story and understood humans and understood why stories matter to humans.
Yes.
Right? Because, whatever I write today, this is 2023 now, 40 years from now, I'm going to be out of date, no matter what. No matter how advanced and cutting edge I think I am, somebody who reads my stuff 40 years from now is going to look, wow, look what he didn't know.
Right. But your humanity and your storytelling, that's timeless.
Yes.
How people react, that thing. It is interesting that because you earlier were talking about time dilation, I think it's the first novel ever written to address that subject was L. Ron Hubbard's To the Stars, and we re-released it in the early 2000s, and we had I think it was People Mag. It was one of those popular magazines reviewed it, and they said it got an A-, in their stuff, saying it's still as gritty, and science today is it hasn't changed on the science today as it was back then. When he wrote it in, I guess it was 1950 or late 40s or something like that.
Right.
But it's interesting. Some science hasn't changed at that point yet, but it's the people and that grittiness of it, and that's what communicates in your storytelling too. You get the people, you become attached to the people, which I think is important too, because if something happens and you lose a person, you get that emotion on because you really liked that person. I only got to know and like those 3 people, so I didn't have to experience. I mean, they definitely got seriously beat up, and
well, things always have to get worse, John. That's
I know.
As AJ says, things get worse.
Yeah, and they certainly did. And I was like, and sometimes it gets rough for me because I'm reading a book a week. Right now, I'm reading like 3 books a week to get ready for Superstars.
Yeah.
And I go through that curve, and it's just because I'm making it so fast, that curve hits, and it has more impact when I get to like, no, and so when those heavy burns happen, I go, oh no, don't kill your darling. Well, fortunately you didn't, but because I'd gotten really attached to her, and so
I like most of my characters to live,
which is good. But
I want the good guy to basically win, and even if they're not winning, I want them always to be well known to be right, but they have to suffer to get to their points. And I will say that I lose 1 or 2 before that's all said and done, but I won't say lose because
yeah. Well, I cheated. I went to the end too. I went 1 and then 9, so I missed the part of the middle part just in preparations for this. So, but I think it's so important to the writers that are listening to this right here. You've got to have that emotional connection with at least the protagonist, but also, get the emotion from the antagonist too, which makes it all the more gritty. And that's when I'm like,
yeah, I want to kind of hammer that a little bit because that was for me, that was a bit of a learning period for me. I mean, intellectually, what you just said, you want to have your characters fully fleshed out and be real human beings and so forth. In my first 10 years of writing, and even during my Writers of Feature time, it turns out that to give myself a benefit of the doubt, I was a pretty good writer even then, but my stories were more hit and miss because I had not actually completely internalized the idea that in order to write full characters consistently, I have to just open myself and really write all the vulnerable pieces, that piece of me I don't like so much, I better hold it back, right? Well, as soon as I do that, then my characters get wooden, right?
Yeah.
I have to trust myself and trust the readers that if I put something out that came out of me that is not happy, or if I find something that maybe is happy but is too close to the bone, I still need to leave it out there. I need to write the stories that matter to me. I need to be myself, and I need to always throw myself out on the page, right?
Right.
If I'm not throwing myself out on the page, then the work is yucky. To use a very scientific term, it becomes yucky.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So I think that is a really key piece, and I wrote about that moment in a little book that I wrote on writing and reading short fiction. I had a situation, a workshop with Chris Rush and Dean Wesley Smith, and afterwards another airplane epiphany, right? I wrote down
Yeah.
stories that matter, and I circled it 3 times, and I went, that's my problem. When I'm writing stories that matter to me, I write really well. When I'm writing stories because I just think they might sell someplace, that's when things go off the track. So
Yeah.
from that point on, I have always written stories that matter to me, and then they generally do pretty well.
Yeah. Well, like on your story, like I forget his name, the Colonel, the one that sabotaged the
Mhm.
when he almost slaps her, is like, oh no, you idiot. I mean, that made him more real. I didn't like that part about him, at all,
That's
but
true.
that's real. It's like, who knows what, can happen. And it just totally like, she was cool. Like, oh no, you idiot,
Mhm.
and so then they were like, okay, it's coming. And then all of a sudden, boom,
Yeah, and he just lost his temper, and so for me, writing that scene was, number one, it was difficult because I didn't like writing that either. But
yeah,
number two, I felt like I had to earn that moment. It needed to be there, and it had to be earned, and so I needed to make sure that the lead up to it was believable, in the sense that, why would this character who wouldn't normally do that,
mm-hmm.
well, why would he do that? You need to see that and be able to say, okay, I get it. And, otherwise then you're just pushing the buttons and nobody likes that. So
No, but it was
hopefully I earned that. Well,
yeah, you did. I mean, it's definitely stuck with me, and like I was in there, like, oh no, why'd you do that? Like I'm in the story, as that's happening. I totally didn't like that. I thought he's an idiot for what he just did there. But in the fact that she had herself an earlier incident where it actually had played out, being struck, and kind of like, okay, now I can see why her reaction is that way. So she was very plausible. And so it's okay, that's humanity. That was humanity in action. And it's that storytelling, that line, that it's the people in there that kept that the people senior. Like you talk about story, but it kept that senior to the technology.
mhm.
So it made it easier to accept the technology because the people were so real.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now, have you read any of Hubbard's stories at all?
Oh yeah. L. Ron Hubbard actually had a warm place in my heart well before the well before the contest, and in particular because I have a very hard time. Every time that I think of L. Ron Hubbard, I think of my uncle Dennis, who was 11 years older than me and passed away early due to some medical issues. But he's the one who introduced me to science fiction and comic books and so forth. And I will always, this photographic picture of sitting in his room, kind of laying up against his bed with his bookshelf, just this row of Battlefield Earth, and then later on Mission Earth, and all sorts of stuff like that. I was not introduced to L. Ron Hubbard's shorter stuff until considerably later, right? But every time I think of L. Ron Hubbard, I think of my uncle, and that leads me to some very good memories. But the thing that I've read that I carry the most, and I have read multiple times actually, is Fear.
Yeah.
Which I picked up after the first workshop, after the first Writers of the Future workshop, specifically for the legend, right? He wrote it in one train setting, right? I thought, well, I want to write like that. I want to write that fast. Can you actually write books that are good that fast? And yeah, it was gripping. It's a great piece of work. And
yeah.
The short fiction that I loved the most from L. Ron Hubbard was when I was out there a couple years back doing the blog post for 33 or 34.
Yeah.
And you guys put on the radio play.
Yeah.
That was awesome. That was such a gripping story. And there were times where I just closed my eyes and let the whole thing flow. Again, L. Ron Hubbard understands story, right? You can Battlefield Earth, you can pick science pieces apart in certain ways, and equipment that's been sitting there for however many years works perfectly well. That's nice. But at the end of the day, L. Ron Hubbard understands story, and he understands what art means, and he understands that that's why he's still read. today. I mean, that's that's the point. So
Okay, good. Well, thank you on that. Yeah, it's I mean, that was also the whole reason why he was able to start and be so effective on creating this contest, the Writers of the Future.
mhm.
We're now in the contest itself is in the 40th year. So we're getting quarterly winners now that'll be published in year 40 in volume 40.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And it's amazing. When I remember interviewing Bob Silverberg, and he said he wrote in one of the first essays, if this makes it to 10 years, that'll be great. And then I got him again. He's written 3 different essays over the years. And each time he says, if it makes it to this, that'd be awesome. If it makes it to this, that'd be awesome. And now it's long since passed. The last time he wrote something was volume 25.
Yeah, and if you think about that, I mean, 40, there's 12 authors per volume plus a handful of published finalists. So, what it basically means is you got 500 plus people walking around on the earth. And I say that purposely because one of the things I loved about Writers of the Future is that it's global, right? We had people, I think the individual who illustrated my first story, I think was from Poland. And, you've got 500 people who are writers and another, 350 or whatever illustrators, because I know sometimes you have illustrators do more than one story, that have been influenced by this legacy of the contest, right? And yeah, not all of them go on to write forever, but an awful lot of them do.
That's right.
And that's that's an amazing thing to leave behind.
Yeah, this year we've got winners from 9 countries being published in volume 39.
There you go. It is really amazing to think about. If you I'm certain that the people that are working on it day to day get caught up in the weeds, but I certainly hope that occasionally you get to step back and look at what you've done. Right?
Yeah,
what you've done, John.
Exactly. I get my nose rubbed into stuff all the time. But on this time here at the plus side of life, that's why I enjoy this conversation with you. It's so much fun because you've got your trajectory, your curve, and I got started, and I can find out how the influence and the effect that Writers of the Future had with you and the judges and the legacy they had. AJ was amazing. Rob Sawyer and the other, just the various people and all. I remember the various things. I remember one time when we went to Cape Kennedy for our Writers of the Future event, and Jack Williamson.
Oh yes,
he passed away some years ago, but he was in his 80s and he'd started writing in 24. I think was his first story. He'd never seen a space launch, and so when we went to Cape Kennedy, and we saw one of the shuttle launches. We were a mile away. We were the closest civilians, and we were there on a little pad of land surrounded by swamp, and you had the signs posted, "Don't go near the water because there's alligators and snakes." And then when he was there along with all these other scientists. I mean, all these other science fiction writers who were themselves, many of them were scientists. Their day job really was rocket scientists, and they were like little kids, even though they were like 70, 80 years old. Feeling that rumble of the engine when it finally hits you, that wave of sound, that shock wave of the taking off. They were just like little kids. It was just, there's so many amazing memories that exist. So, but being able to talk with you and other past winners, talking with Dean and Chris, and whatnot, it's just, you really see the legacy that Mr. Hubbard left. And it's really nice being part of that and just, having this.
Yeah, I met Jack Williamson. You mentioned him. I met him in the first Writers of the Future week, and that was like a highlight of my career too. Jack Williamson. I think science fiction is an interesting world because you can go to science fiction conventions and meet lots of people that are, we're a very accessible community, especially now with social media, you can contact all sorts of folks.
Right.
But the workshop is a different situation. You're in a really intimate situation for, you're sitting there for a week with 3 of the best instructors that you can run into. And then you've got this never-ending stream where you spend 2 days sitting down and talking. Jack Williamson comes in and he's around for 2 or 3 days and you can talk with him, and Jerry Purnell when he was alive, and Larry Niven, and just this never-ending stream of really interesting people that, yes, you can go to a convention, but you might get 15 minutes of somebody's time to chat. But instead, you're sitting there all night with Dave Wolverton talking about what it means to be a career writer, right? I mean, talk about a life-changing opportunity, right? You don't get that opportunity when you go to a convention.
That's right. Now I just looked at the clock and went, oh my gosh, we've gone an hour. So I need to wrap this up. But for someone that's not familiar with your works, what do you recommend and you can break it down by genre too, if you want to, as introduction to Ron Collins?
Well, my two primary series are the Stealing the Sun series that we've been talking about quite a bit. Obviously, that's my current hard science fiction series. I also have a epic fantasy series, Saga of the God-Touched Mage, that did quite well when it was first launched and still sells today. People seem to describe it as what fantasy would be if you took out all of the dross stuff that nobody reads, which I kind of liked. That was cool. The more fun thing going on right this minute is my daughter and I. My daughter is also a writer. She writes a lot of fantasy and fae kind of things. And we are just now getting ready to launch a brand new series of baseball in Feyland series that's going to go onto a Kickstarter here. I think you can actually find it right now as far as the preliminary notifications are concerned. So that's going to be my next series going forward. And then sometime later this year, I'm going to do another collaboration with my brother, who is a musician out there in Los Angeles. And we're going to do a multimedia, just a fun, wacky Star Cruise thing where a couple of brothers who are entertainers hop from cruise line to cruise line and run into kind of Scooby-Doo mysteries that are going to be kind of fun. So you can find me on my website, typosphere.com. It's probably the best way to find all the different things that I do.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ron. And it's been, as I knew it would be, a lot of fun, having a chance to chat with you. And I really enjoyed reading the books too. So that's definitely my perk for my job, is being able to read such amazing fiction.
Yeah, you have a very tough job, John. I feel for you to have to read all of these books in order to do your job. Thank you so much. I've had a great time, and it's been great catching up with you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. We are especially appreciative of our sponsor, Carnation, for supporting this podcast. Carnation has been making delicious milk products for over a century and is still going strong. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Ron.
Thank you so much, John. Have a great day.